When Laura asked me last fall if I would like to do a sermon, I said, about what? I used to come up here and talk about Native American spirituality, and I talked about social action after coming back from GA one year, and I gave another sermon one time about rushing, how we're all rushing all the time, even in retirement, you know? Minute to minute, week to week, year to year, and the years fly by, and what happens? But I've never talked in public about jazz. It still is my one really big passion, though. If you saw me during the music, I was sitting there bopping along. It's in my body. I grew up hearing big band music in my home. My dad was a dancer, and I used to get on his feet. We'd go around the living room, and, you know, I guess that laid a foundation, because that's based on what they call the Great American Songbook, Tin Pan Alley, Gershwin, you know, and the people who interpreted that music, Tommy Dorsey and Glenn Gray and all those folks. Then, when my parents separated and we moved in with my grandmother, who had a piano, I found in the piano bench music of my aunt's, which was from the 40s pretty much. And I had been taking lessons, and I started playing that stuff, and I found a lot of meaning. To a teenage girl, that's something, a lot of meaning from that old music. But it sort of built on what my parents had taught me, and eventually, when I started to hear jazz, that music came back to me. It's the same music, you know, interpreted maybe differently by the big bands versus the small jazz combos that Bud mentioned, although we did have our jazz big bands as well. Duke Ellington, Stan Kenton, people like that. Anyway, it grabbed me. It's rhythmic. It has a lot of soul, I think. So that's why I'm up here talking about it today. And out there that day in the parking lot with Laura, I thought, well, jazz? So what am I going to, why am I going to talk about jazz in a Unitarian church, right? And then I thought, you know what? There's a lot of similarities, believe it or not. The first obvious one to me is improvisation. In a jazz setting, there are 5 players maybe in the smaller combos, and they start out with the melody that everybody knows, one of the old songs usually, or maybe one of the jazz numbers written by what to most Americans would be an obscure composer. But then each person in the combo gets to do a variation on the melody, an improvisation. And it's based on what he or she, usually he, is feeling at that moment from the song, from the bandmates, from the audience, and inside too. It's an expression of what's going on. That's improvisation, right? It happens in the moment. I think that we improvise as you used, stretching the word a little bit, because we are charged to use freedom and reason to figure out individually what is meaning to us in the realm of spirituality and in life. How do we live our lives? We don't have a creed here that we all follow. Each one of us has thought about this and decided what makes sense. And that's what's so beautiful. We're all different, but we all fit in here. So I call that improvisation. Now, I'm talking here today about classical jazz. And there's a lot of different terms. I used to call bebop classical jazz. And I'll tell you what bebop is in a minute. But then I was corrected by some players and fans. They said classical jazz is really what started in New Orleans. It came out of the slave experience, the hollers in the fields. And then they went to church here and they heard your Western European music, right? They developed the spirituals. And the blues grew out of that, right? Well, jazz grew out of that. And it became, beginning of the last century, a very joyful music that was used a lot when they paraded through the streets. That's what we call the Dixieland jazz. Lots of horns, you know, and very upbeat, and lots of fun. So I guess properly, that is traditional jazz. Classical jazz is what came after that, sometime later around the 30s, late 30s, 40s. People like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie and Miles Davis, who got away from always having the upbeat tempo, and more into a more introspective jazz. It was upbeat many times, but it wasn't all those familiar melodies. It was a lot of notes being played and real fast sometimes. In fact, how I really got into jazz was I was driving through Pennsylvania on the way home from a vacation one time, and I was bored with what was on the radio. Did you ever drive across the country and try to listen to the radio? So we went into a truck stop, of all things, and here I looked at the cassette tapes, showing you my age, and here's Miles Davis, Kind of Blue. I thought, I've read about him. I used to read The Village Voice for you New Yorkers, you know what that is. Mm-hmm. That's where I got my politics, by the way, in New York. So I bought it, and I was like, wow, this is fabulous. And there weren't a lot of songs on there that I knew, but it really hooked me, and he still is one of my favorite artists. I love his solo work, his slower work. He was a cool jazz artist more. Anyway, that's what really got me going, and that was in the 80s. So, also thanks to Laura, I was led to a 12-year-old article in UU World, which, if you saw the thing that came out, where was that? Was it our invitation from Audrey? Somewhere it came out on email, the how to find this article. The man that wrote it was at the time the editor. His name is Tom Stites, and he's from Massachusetts, as many of you are. And I found so much inspiration in that article, I thought, now I've got more than one thing to say. I emailed him, I told him how much I appreciated his insights, and he did this, the same thing I'm trying to do here, the parallels between UU and jazz. He sent me a wealth of material, prayers, music, readings, you know, two sermons, one of which was given at a Christian church. And I thought, oh my goodness, where else could I do this except in the UU community, write to a stranger and say, can you help me? And he did. Great guy. So one of his first points was that jazz is music of celebration. It gets us out of our heads and into our bodies, and we UUs are often stuck up here, right? The joy that's felt by the improviser as he or she explores their personal statement is usually felt by the audience. If you've ever sat in a jazz club and you've watched somebody just go into a solo when he gets like this, like, do it. It's amazing. It's just amazing. And if you listen, oftentimes you'll hear a reflection of old tunes. They'll throw in old stuff and pointers to things from the past. But then they go on, you know, and it's wonderful. It causes excitement, I think, in the listener. I remember the first time I heard Sonny Rollins' song, St. Thomas. It's a calypso. I was at the semi-annual Cape May Jazz Festival that Chris and I used to go to, but I was with Twyla that time. I was sitting on a bar stool. I could not contain myself. I got up and I started dancing calypso in the bar, all by myself. I could not sit there. It was so uplifting. The Reverend Suzanne Meyer, who was the senior minister of the First Unitarian Church of St. Louis, also believed that jazz has a place in our worship and that we need to get out of our heads more. She developed what she called blues theology in a series of lectures. To her, the music opens the way to the religious experience of transcendence, to the ecstatic. You know, really, all music arises from the Spirit. You see it in every religion, every world religion. The chants of Buddhism, the plain song of the monks in Europe, the sacred drums of Africa, right? But you don't have to be in a sanctuary, of course, to move your spirit. And when you are, the music doesn't have to be a Bach chorale, right? Jim Scott, you all know who Jim Scott is, right? He's one of our most prolific hymn writers, conductors, players, arrangers. He helped compose the Paul Winter Concert's Missa Gaia. You all familiar with that? You hear that at New Year's usually. Anyway, he has created jazz vocal arrangements of many of our hymns in Singing the Living Tradition. He says that at General Assembly workshops on jazzing up the hymnal in recent years, people packed the place. They loved it. Now, to continue Steit's analysis, jazz is a deep metaphor for Unitarian Universalism. The music and this religion, not all religions, but our specific religion, resonate on a remarkable number of levels. First, at their cores, jazz and Unitarian Universalism are democratic in the broadest sense. Steitz explains it this way: in a jazz group, as in any community, certain roles need to be filled. Someone has to play the melody, someone has to keep time, someone has to suggest a harmonic context. In jazz, each instrumentalist has to understand his or her role in the group well enough so that he or she can improvise on it and not just follow directions. Does that sound familiar? Playing in a jazz group involves both responsibility and freedom. Freedom consists of understanding your responsibility well enough to act independently and still make the needed contribution to the group. As such, a jazz performance is a working model of democracy. So, what do we have in our UU congregations? Responsibility with freedom and acting independently. We answer to no authority other than the membership. We take direct responsibility for choosing our ministers, approving budgets, and electing governing boards to oversee the congregation's business. Members are entrusted with carrying out tasks independently, with responsibility to the whole. Make sense? It's a parallel. Second, both jazz and UU are inclusive rather than exclusive. Everybody is welcome, and everybody is welcome to improvise. As I explained above, Unitarian Universalism means that each of us must search for our own truth and meaning, the fourth principle, right? And like jazz players, we draw from many sources of inspiration. And neither jazz nor UU improvisation is for the faint-hearted. It requires real courage to take responsibility for our own religious lives, both as individuals and congregations. Think about that. You're not in a church where you're told what to believe, okay? I mean, it takes courage to say, no, I don't see it that way, but here's what speaks to me. That really does take courage in a country that is, so religiously oriented in some ways. Third, when everybody is welcome to improvise in jazz or in church, some dissonance is inevitable. People tend to regard dissonance as grating and tension as bad. But dissonance can be holy. Liberal religion rests on the theological premise that by coming together with all our differences, we summon the holy, the sacred. That's because people who are responsible for their own truths always produce tension when trying to be in relationship. So being part of churches like ours challenges us to learn from each other as we work to resolve the tension and refine our truths. And that's where our democracy comes in. We listen to each other, we respect each other's views, and we try to work as best we can via the compromise method rather than, how many are in favor of, although we do that as well. But we try to respect everybody's views. In a jazz ensemble, some see a Unitarian freedom of spirit, a willingness to enter into new territory, for sure. When you do your solo, you are off. You are responsible to the whole and the audience and yourself, but mostly to yourself, But before you improvise, you have to have a strong spirit, a strong sense of what has already been laid down, just like we have our, Judeo-Christian roots and we draw from the world religions. The accomplishments of the musicians who have gone before must be a part of the mix. A lesson about humility can be drawn from jazz as well. If you don't listen to the other players with humility, you're in trouble. Likewise in CUUC, as I said, we draw from Judeo-Christian roots, world religions. We honor all that went before us. Another similarity with jazz. America prides itself on being a meritocracy, a society of equals based on merit, and not things like skin color or religion or sexual orientation or whatever. But our country does falter. Jazz is closer to being one, a meritocracy, than many institutions. To be a jazz performer, all you gotta do is be able to play this demanding and sophisticated music well enough and you're in. That's what a jazz jam is about. You ever been to one of those? People come, listen to the music on stage, they've got their instruments, they're invited up, and they play, they join in. No rehearsal, that's a jazz jam. You don't need conservatory training. The conventional wisdom of the power elite carries no weight. It doesn't matter in jazz that you're not a superstar. What matters is that you can play. No affirmative action program has ever been needed, at least for race. And here's where Stites and I parted company a little bit. Gender has been a bit more problematic. Women have played formative roles since an 18-year-old named Lil Hardin was the pianist in King Oliver's seminal Creole jazz band in New Orleans in 1920. Anybody heard that name? Lil Hardin or King Oliver? Yeah, he was Louis Armstrong's inspiration and mentor. 2 years later, a young unknown cornet player named Louis Armstrong joined that group. Hardin played on Armstrong's famous Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings and was, for a time, his wife. That was 1920. She was the first woman to become known as a player in jazz history. And there's a big difference between players and singers for the women. The truth is, there haven't been that many women who have been recognized as true jazz players. Over the decades, there was Mary Lou Williams, maybe some of you know her, and Marion McPartland, piano player, both of them. Things are improving now, I'm happy to say, though most well-known women in jazz are still singers, not players. Wynton Marsalis, how many know that name? He's the founder and director of Jazz at Lincoln Center in New York. He has never had a woman permanently in his jazz orchestra. Most orchestras these days will do blind auditions. They have a curtain between them and the player so that they're not influenced by gender or anything else. What can I say? As for sexual orientation, Duke Ellington's longtime collaborator and arranger, Billy Strayhorn, who is best known as the composer of the great ballad Lush Life, and of Ellington's famous theme song, Take the A Train, I bet you all know that one. Yeah. He composed that. He was an out gay man in an era that offered few havens for gay people, and that lasted, trust me, till very recently. Just recently, a few established players have quietly come out. Gary Burton, who plays vibraphone, Fred Hirsch, who plays piano. There may be more, but those are the big names that I know. So, because of the generous spirit and sturdy character of so many of the people who gave the world this music, jazz became the groundbreaking force for racial integration. Like Unitarian Universalism, the jazz world was and is far from a utopia. And even though the music is truly colorblind, not all its players have been. But jazz musicians took on Jim Crow, and exploitative booking agents and music publishers and other obstacles erected by a society that proclaims high ideals but too rarely lives by them. As the music matured, it drew more and more admirers, even whites. This was a black music mostly in the beginning. Until it gathered the power to break through these forces in ways that forever changed our culture. More than a decade before Jackie Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers, Benny Goodman used the power of his fame to break the taboos of the 1930s. You know who Benny Goodman is? He's considered a jazz artist, although my dad would argue, no, he's a swinging, orchestra leader. He performed with racially integrated groups in Carnegie Hall and in hundreds of other places where this had been unthinkable before. So look at what has happened since. Most jazz groups today are totally integrated, which is a great thing. Audiences are too, which is a great thing. Now, a little background. Early in its history, jazz developed a stigma for being worldly, played in dimly lit, smoke-filled venues, including bordellos. It was deemed inappropriate for Sunday morning. The word itself, how many of you know what the word itself, jazz, used to mean in the South? Sex. Southern slang term, with sacred compositions. Among them, pianist Mary Lou Williams with the album Black Christ of the Andes, and Duke Ellington, who performed 3 sacred concerts in churches and cathedrals across the US and Europe. In fact, we have one of his compositions in our hymnal. It's called Come Sunday. It's a beautiful, slow piece. Many congregations have incorporated different types of music into their services, including jazz. The success of such services and the number of people who are drawn to them suggests that bringing jazz and other non-traditional music into our churches serves as a beacon of welcome to people who do not easily identify with the church music of European culture. Debbie's use of modern music, which she played on her iPad a few weeks ago, was an example of this, I think. At first I was like, what's that? But what we sing is who we are, says Reverend Jason Shelton, Associate Minister for Music of the UU Church of Nashville. If we want to talk about being inclusive and multicultural, and our music is confined to Western European art music, we have a conflict. Now I know we played a lot of stuff today that you don't usually hear in our church or any church. All in good taste, all good stuff, I thought. I hope it went down with you okay. But it does have, if you listen to the words, so much inspiration, so much ethics, so much heartfelt searching, you know? But anyway, to summarize, one way or another, jazz hooks into everything that is American. In a triumph of the human spirit of the highest order, jazz arose from the national sin of this country, slavery. Slave traders and owners did all they could to crush the culture of the people they brought from West Africa. But there was no way to prevent the slaves from singing. As they were exposed to European music, usually in church, like I said, they adapted forms and harmonies to their own rhythms and inflections. You might say that the enslaved Africans and their descendants integrated European and African music into something that is uniquely American. In the spirit that results, you can hear both the joys and the sorrows of the slaves' experience. You can still hear that in some of the blues. The spirit triumphed, and what a contribution this triumph has made to the world. Jazz is considered by many, by me, to be our only truly American music. Thank you.